Thank you for inviting me. My name's Mike Gulliver. I'm a researcher at the University of Bristol. Can I just check everyone in here can hear me okay? Is that, yeah, good. Right, you're all sitting a long way away. I'm not a disability theorist scholar. I don't have a background in disability studies. My background is actually originally as a linguist. Interestingly, my first contact with deaf people was in Canada, in Quebec, so where I was working as a French-English interpreter. And as a historian of minority nationhood, and that's why I got interested in deaf people. So a lot of my background is going to be different from yours if you're disability scholars, and so I'm really interested in that exchange that we can have about that. My main interests are in deaf space, the spaces of deaf culture, deaf realities. It's important to start by saying I'm not deaf. That may seem obvious, but it's not. Many deaf people can speak well. It's important to say because it means that I'm not speaking for deaf people. There are deaf people who have many and varied opinions about this stuff, and my view is that of a hearing person who works on speaking to my community, the community of hearing people. It's largely a community of academics, policymakers and experts who very often control the spaces in which deaf people live and work. And I guess it's important because I'm talking about the future. And so it's important to say that I'm not pushing any particular future. I am interested in critically engaging with different futures. And I will, if pushed at the end, tell you what I think, but actually I'm much more interested in that critical engagement than I am in promoting any kind of specific future. And I hope the reason for that will become clear towards the end of my talk. And so I need to acknowledge deaf people who aren't here, all the deaf academics who've trained me, deaf people who made me aware even of this series, people like Norman McGill, who made me aware of this series and actually encouraged me to apply, and the deaf community itself, without whom I would have absolutely no evidence and nothing to talk about today. So I just want to acknowledge them and then move on. Now, I was going to start with a treat. I was going to start with a clip from Doctor Who, but I can't get my Netflix to log in, and it would swamp Carlton's feed and everything else, so we're not going to have the Doctor Who clip. But if you want to see it, it's the Beneath the Lake one, in which they find a spaceship and they tow it on board an underwater analysis station, and in which the first person that you actually hear speaking is the sign language interpreter for Cass, who's one of the team who uses sign language. And the date on the clip comes from the captain's private journal, and it's 2119. And the question that I very often ask when I play that is, in 100 years' time, will we still have sign language? Will we still have deaf people? Will we still have sign language interpreters? We have entered, scientists tell us, a period of global history that is distinct from any that has come before, following millions, billions of years of terrestrial evolution, and about 10,000 that we call the Holocene. You can see that as that little yellow slice under the truck at the top. For those who can't see, I'm showing a continual map of the various epochs that have shaped the Earth, the geological epochs. Holocene is an interesting term. It comes from the Greek holos, meaning whole. The idea is that it contains all of the history of modern humanity, which of course is rather a misnomer. And if you know anything about indigenous peoples, Native American peoples, Aboriginal peoples in Australia, you'll know their history. Their remembered history goes back well beyond 10,000 years. And ours does too, of course. It's rather more gently referred to more recently as the period of written history. And that term Holocene was proposed in 1867 and was finally adopted in 1885. So it's a very late Victorian term. which tells you a lot about the kind of era in which these judgments of everythingness were being made. And that idea that we assume that we know everything that there is to know is something that will surface again and again in this paper. Since the 1960s in the Soviet Union, and more recently here, scientists have been suggesting that we're now entering a new global epoch, one in which humanity, through its actions, is shaping global Earth systems. They call this period the Anthropocene, from anthropos, which means human. The Anthropocene affects our planet. We're increasingly acknowledging this. It also affects the things that live on it. Our agency to not only shape crops. Let me show you a couple of these. Can you guess what that is? Showing a picture of a fruit. It's a watermelon. That's quite different from a modern watermelon, right? What about that? Can you tell what that is?
Banana.
That's a banana. Yeah. To not only shape crops, but where they grow. In 2011, Charles Mann published a book called 1493. If you don't know, 1493 was the year that Columbus sailed from Spain to establish permanent colonies in the Americas. He took with him plants and animals, citrus fruit, apples, bananas, onions, coffee, wheat, rice. He brought back plants and animals, maize, tomatoes, potatoes, vanilla, cacao, rubber, tobacco. Imagine what the history of the world might have been if we had left things where they were. No potatoes, no Irish famine, at least not from potato blight. No Irish migration to the Americas, no Ronald Reagan, no George Bush, possibly no Iraq War, possibly no 9/11. Donald Trump survived, he's German and Scottish. These are incidental impacts which again we'll come to as a concept. Mann's argument is that in 1493 a global exchange of goods began which over the last 500 years has led to a reduction in biodiversity on a planetary scale and increasing fragility of the things that we have. I showed you bananas. Did you know that there are no fertile bananas anymore? Those little seeds that you get in bananas cannot produce banana plants. All bananas are grafts now from a huge banana plant, not one, but spread out. And so if we had a banana blight, we would lose all bananas. We have sterilized it by breeding more and more tasty and sugary bananas. I have wandered on purpose because I think we need to grasp the size of the picture that I'm painting. We as humanity have reached a point in our ever-accelerating development as a species, and I'll come back to development 2 later on, where we are shaping natural biological planetary systems and species, including ourselves. This is my son. Did you know that increasingly children in the West are becoming short-sighted? It's because for children's eyes to form and hold shape, they need sunlight, and we spend too much time inside. An optometrist I know tells me that this has been known for years, but that no one's really done anything about it. After all, you can't legislate for people to spend time outside, and when the eyewear industry makes so much profit on every pair of glasses and contact lenses that they sell, why would they encourage it? At least they don't manufacture need, though, something that some have suggested can't be said for the pharmaceutical industry. In a series of books and articles published a few years ago and picked up recently by the HuffPost, researchers describe the practice of disease mongering, an unholy cycle in which pharma companies lobby to, quote, pathologize everyday experiences, convince doctors they are serious problems, and then offer the cure. There is legislation, says Adriana Fu-Berman of Georgetown University, against promoting a drug before it goes to market, but there is no regulation on creating diseases. My point here is not to bash the pharmaceutical companies, but to suggest that in the Anthropocene, it's not just the environment that we alter. We also alter our bodies, and not only our bodies, but our expectations of what our bodies should be. We are reauthoring our normal, our natural. To paraphrase Donna Haraway's argument from the Cyborg Manifesto, where we might have been in the past natural bodies inhabiting natural environments, we are becoming engineered bodies inhabiting engineered environments. But that's okay, because we have glasses for myopia, and we have pacemakers for heart disease, and we have hearing aids for deafness. I hadn't forgotten I was here to talk about deaf people. The history of the deaf community is actually one that very clearly tells the story of that shift from natural bodies in natural environments to engineered bodies in engineered environments. Humanity has always had deaf and signing people. More than 2,000 years ago, the ancient Greeks were already describing communities that communicated in sign. But for most of human history, most deaf people have been scattered amongst the hearing. We commonly assume the number of naturally occurring profoundly deaf people in the population to be somewhere around 1 in 1,000. But as we'll see in a moment, the causes of that deafness are many and varied, and most deaf people, at least until 250 years ago, were isolated individuals. Isolated, that is, except for places where there were higher ratios of deafness. In some rural areas, the Kentish Weald in the UK, for example, and areas of New England in the Americas, or in families where inherited deafness is passed down sometimes for as many as a dozen generations, or in cities where there are simply more people and so more deaf people. In those places, as deaf people encountered each other, interacted over time, sign languages evolved, developed, and were passed on. And to those places, other deaf people were drawn, initially organically of their own volition, but from the late 18th century, with the establishment of schools and then churches and then clubs for deaf people, much more systematically. Exported, if you like, in the language of Man's 1493, into spaces where they thrived. Deaf homelands, this is a picture of the National Deaf Institute in Paris. Places where they learned sign language and deaf culture, where they grew to identify themselves as members of a linguistic and cultural minority. But as that identity was formed in those spaces and relied on transmission within those spaces, the deaf community, its language and integrity depended very much on the ongoing preservation of the spaces themselves. Which wasn't a problem while they were natural bodies in more or less natural environments, but became much more a problem as educational policy, and then social policy, and then technologies, and then medicine focuses on integration, mainstream education, bionic restoration, and so on, have all targeted the eradication of that natural deaf reality. And to expect that eradication at some very near future point. In a placement that we run in Bristol at the Deaf Studies Trust for medical students, only a few weeks ago I sat in a panel discussion with mothers of deaf children. All of them talked about the expectation of those involved in the diagnosis and treatment, in inverted commas, of their deaf children. That they would adopt solutions that would in the future give their children the best chance in society. Read, in hearing society. The assumption appears commonsensical. The number of schools for deaf people is dropping from 75 in the UK to 23 in 2010. I believe that's naturally down to 12. Deaf clubs are closing. Bristol's Deaf Club closed around the same time that the University of Bristol closed the Centre for Deaf Studies. Glasgow's Deaf Centre closed this summer. In an austerity world, local councils just won't make the funding available. And why would they? When they're being told that the number of deaf children in those deaf schools that remain is dropping quickly. And that evidence is real. But it's not actually telling us anything other than that with the closure of deaf schools, a lot more deaf children are going into mainstream education. But in the face of it and its easy conclusion that the challenges of deafness, again in inverted commas, are gradually being overcome, why would you not cut services that appear to be becoming quickly redundant? Why would you not shift your focus to cater to a post-deaf world? David mentioned Len Davis in his work. He's one of the people who's used post-deafness as a trope. Of course, it's not post-deaf. Its deaf population is still there. It's simply being refragmented out of sight. So what we now have is all of those children who are deaf, still deaf, having to cope in a world that's gradually withdrawing support in anticipation of them not needing it in the future. Except it is true that the number of deaf people is dropping. Although, ironically, that's actually nothing to do with treatments that focus on deafness. It's actually as a consequence of something else. Now, I know you can't see the stats on that sheet, but those stats are from Gallaudet University. If you don't know, Gallaudet is a university that evolved from the first deaf school in the States and has gradually become a university over time, is now a university that predominantly teaches deaf people in sign language. It's unique apart from Rochester Institute of Technology in the world. They publish figures on the makeup of their student population. From 2000 to 2006, those stats listed the causes of the deafness of their students. In 2000, they found that of their deaf students, 5.9 were deaf because of meningitis. By 2006, that figure had dropped to 2.3%. The reason is the impact of the introduction of a vaccine against meningitis C. The rate of meningitis dropped, the number of those being deafened because of meningitis dropped, and so there are fewer deaf people. Over 50% fewer, in fact, in less than 10 years. What about other areas? Well, there's another one called otitis media, and if you don't know what that means, it's an ear infection. It's earache. Now, ear infections in children are commonly left untreated most of the time because the dangers of antibiotic overuse are antimicrobial resistance. Antibiotics are a systemic drug. They influence the whole body. What they do in one place is done in another, and so the impact is widespread. Not only does it affect the body, but it leads to the bacteria that cause the infection becoming resistant to the treatment. Clearly, this is a problem in the West, but it's a much bigger problem in the Third World, and so the World Health Organization has identified finding alternatives to systemic antibiotics as one of its priorities. In 2012, the WHO's Director General, Dr. Margaret Chan, warns that the growing threat of antibiotic resistance poses grave risks for society. Every antibiotic ever developed is at risk of becoming useless, she said. A post-antibiotic era means, in effect, an end to modern medicine as we know it. Things as common as a throat infection or a scratched knee could once again kill. What is the solution? Well, it could be this. This is a nanobot, which you ingest. It seeks out infected tissue, it binds itself to infected tissue, it zaps the infected tissue, and then you secrete it in your wee. Now, the advantage of nanotechnology is it's very easy to define. It's very specific. It targets only the infected tissue. It's not a systemic drug. And it's hugely simple to administer. You just wrap it in a pill and swallow it. And so it becomes pharmacy again. You see, it's all part of an unholy storm of marketed normals and collateral impacts and evidence that tells a story about one thing but is potentially actually about another. And yet the improvement of health is important. It's a good thing, right, that we're improving health. And if there's a collateral impact on deaf people, well, define improve, define health, define better. You see, deafness has been part of the human reality since forever. It's part of our species' biodiversity. A diversity that has described a whole range of variation. A diversity that has required humanity to acknowledge, support, accommodate, adjust to, celebrate difference. A diversity that suggests that human health, seen apart from the purely mechanical of the body, our existential health, if you like. We might be much more healthy with that diversity rather than in a smooth, streamlined Teflon world of identikit physical biomedical health. And why anyway, except for sheer convenience, which is in effect money, probably, at the end of the day, would we reject deaf culture and language? I mean, it is in every sense as completely and utterly valid as hearing culture and language. In fact, its evolution as something that is only deaf is a pure historical accident. It has evolved as something that deaf people do. And there are aspects to it that are born out of deaf experiences of being deaf in the world. But it's not clear that the visual culture itself is deaf only. In fact, if you go back about 1 million years to the point where humanity was just beginning to develop language, it developed both physical and vocal gesturing at the same time. And then for whatever reason, maybe because it was easier to gesture vocally if you were holding a spear or firewood, we gradually prioritized vocal communication. But there is nothing in non-verbal language that makes it any less complete as a system. Just pause for a minute and think what our society, civilization, technologies, communications would look like if instead of adopting spoken language as a species, we had instead adopted natural visual sign languages. Many of the things that we consider now to be deaf culture would just be culture. And so deaf culture is less a product of a group excluded from the mainstream than it is a mini snapshot of what that visual reality of humanity could have been like. It's evidence of the outworking of the biodiversity of the human species. For those who celebrate it, of the bursting through of creative potential of humanity in just one of the ways that humans could have been. But for those who regard biodiversity as less inherently important, it's a way of life that can, if we remove the causes or address the consequences, could without loss to humanity disappear. In the meantime, however, there's something very interesting going on here, because even as we develop agency to increasingly remove deafness from the range of what it means to be human, that agency is, rather like the proverbial moving target, fundamentally reauthoring that standard of what human is itself. In some cases, actually offering those who are cyborged with the technologies abilities that outstrip the natural human standard to which they're being, in theory, restored. I'll explain what I mean. This is an app that allows you to tune your hearing aid. So you can tune the EQ on your hearing aid, you can adapt it to different environments, you can turn it up in a pub or down, you can eliminate the bass, you can eliminate the treble, you can tune it to a phone. It effectively allows you to engineer the sounds that you get through. This is an app that takes the sound that bats make and Dopplers it down so that it's in audible human frequencies, or frequencies that are audible to humans. Now, as far as I know, this hasn't been in real time linked to anything which will actually then play them, but there's nothing to stop you from being able to hold this out, listen to bats, have it Dopplered down, and actually hear the bats that are around you in real time. There's no reason at all why you couldn't interface that into a hearing aid so that somebody with a hearing aid could do that. This is early technology of a parabolic hearing aid that would allow you to listen at the things that listen to the things that you're looking at. So you could, for example, select a single person at a distance and hone in on what they're saying. Distances that would actually preclude natural hearing being able to pick up what they're hearing. I'm not sure whether this goes. This goes there. Okay. There's a good case to argue then that in not very many years, those with hearing aids might be able to access different types of hearing from those without hearing aids. Greater ranges, better hearing, potentially, than those with natural bodies. And this raises an issue for those committed to, again, in inverted commas, restorative interventions. How far do you go? Do you cap the capacity of hearing technologies implanted into deaf people so that it's up to, but no better than, natural hearing? And what about biohacking? What happens if someone like me, who is hearing, but who struggles with the sensory onslaught of sound, buys one to gain the ability to turn off my ears? This kind of issue isn't unique to deaf people. Across the board, human agency is now threatening the integrity of the previously inviolable thresholds of the human body. I'm sure you're all aware of how in 2012, Oscar Pistorius, the Blade Runner, successfully qualified for and ran in the men's Olympic 400-meter semi-final, where he came last and was eliminated. His attempt to reach the final was roundly celebrated, though. And though he'd beaten runners not using blades in qualifying heats, there was little real debate about whether they gave a runner using them an advantage. He lost. Obviously, they didn't. Until the final of the T44 200 meters in the Paralympics later that summer, when Pistorius was roundly beaten by Alan Oliveira from Brazil. Pistorius complained immediately after the race that Oliveira's blades were too long, and that had given him an advantage. The issue, of course, is that in the case of an athlete with no legs, there is no way to know how tall they should be, and therefore no way to know how long the blade should be. The International Paralympic Council's guidance, their committee's guidance, therefore, is to take arm span, as you can see, and to estimate the length of their legs. Athletes are then allowed to select their height and blades within 3.5% variance of that estimate. Oliveira actually ran on blades that were shorter than Pistorius's, but he had changed them a few weeks before to ones that were slightly longer than he had previously used, allowing less speed out of the blocks, but a longer stride once up to speed. Interestingly, Pistorius was impeded in his ability to make his complaint stick, because he too could have chosen to up the length of his blades, or to use a different blade entirely, which he'd elected not to do, for fear that it would show that a different composite of blades conferred an advantage on the runner. You probably all know that the Pistorius story ended when he was convicted of murder and imprisonment. However, the question of blades and the benefit that they might confer continued. In 2016, the Paralympic long jumper Marcus Rain failed in his attempt to compete in the Rio Olympics that year, when the IOC decided that his blades did give him a potential advantage. An advantage over what? You see, the issue with a natural body is that if it's unenhanced, then it's unenhanced. That's just the way it is. But nature is capricious. When racing, Miguel Indurain, cyclist extraordinaire, had a cardiac output of 50 litres a minute. Now that compares to the average male cardiac output of 25 litres a minute. And a VO max, that's how much oxygen his system would transport around, nearly twice that of the average male. He was, in effect, an example of the margins of our human biodiversity, and because of that and a lot of training, won a lot of races. Was he normal? No. Nor are deaf people normal. Deaf people have significantly larger neural rim areas within the optic nerve. They also demonstrate significantly larger visual fields and a significantly different pattern of retinal nerve fiber layer distribution. In other words, deaf people have significantly enhanced abilities to work with their peripheral vision and thicker optic nerves than non-deaf people. But is this celebrated? Well, rather the opposite. It's actually the result, according to the researchers who wrote that paper, of adaptation due to a, quote, lifetime of sensory deprivation. And it's not just in physiology. Deaf languages are all different, but they allow deaf people to communicate between them interlinguistically in extraordinarily complete ways. In fact, this has been such a feature of deaf people's experience that as far back as the 1830s, deaf people were arguing that they were uniquely able to bring greater harmony to a world riven by linguistic nationalism because of their universal language. But we would gladly see those languages eradicated if the cyborging of deaf people required it, so that we could teach them our spoken, limited, non-internationally universal language. Rather like some would gladly see the eradication of up to 1 million indigenous people if the current Amazonian land grab required it. I started with the environment, and I'm drawing this back to the environment for good reason. It's because it's in the area of the environment and environmental politics that these questions are being most visibly debated. When I started working on this a few years ago, few outside of geography had heard of the Anthropocene. Extinction Rebellion didn't exist, and it was generally news to the students I was teaching that cows didn't always look like they do until they were selectively bred to produce 1,800 burgers, each of which has the carbon footprint of a 15-mile car journey. They were unaware then, not so now. Now we have a 16-year-old Swede rejecting modern air travel and electing to spend days deliberately travelling slowly across the Atlantic on a sailing boat. Embracing the slow, embracing the natural as the direction in which humanity should develop is not yet normal, but it's growing. It's being called by some degrowth. The belief that the only viable future for humanity is to engage, to re-engage with how we are part of the biodiverse ecological balance of the planet, and to weave ourselves back into a sustainable relationship with nature. That's a future contested by eco-modernism, the belief that, quote, knowledge and technology applied with wisdom might allow for a good, even a great Anthropocene. Degrowth and eco-modernism suggest quite different futures, not only for the environment, but for deaf culture. Interestingly though, both of them have quite similar endpoints. It's a feature of degrowth that we respect the natural biodiversity of the planet. So it's also a feature that we respect the natural biodiversity of humanity, not only respect it, but embrace it. And embracing biodiversity means embracing the fact that all humanity could have ended up signing rather than speaking. This is something felt particularly within some sections of the signing community, that while sign language emerged from deaf interactions, it is a perfectly valid language that could be embraced just as well by hearing people as part of our wider human heritage. A return to the fundamentals of human difference. Signing humans, speaking humans, hearing humans, visual humans. Humans with time and space to adapt and flex and accommodate. A return to the natural, the imperfect, the human. The future offered by technologically mediated eco-modernism doesn't look very different, because at the heart of that movement, it's a belief in technology as a route to solutions that could mean being able to become hearing if originally deaf, but could equally mean becoming deaf if originally hearing. And that could also mean that actually deafness or hearingness doesn't really matter. The questions of audiological deafness are relegated to the margins of relevancy as further layers of technology allow people to remain just as they are, or become whatever they want, but then communicate in any language they choose by providing instantaneous mediation between, for example, sign language into speech, or speech into text, or text into sign. And so the degrowth future, taken to its logical conclusion, and the eco-modern future, taken to its logical conclusion, effectively allows for a mixture of deaf and hearing communicating in pretty much any form people want to choose. It's just that the paths to those futures and the kinds of humans that are produced along the way differ radically. The challenge for us is that policy is already acting as if what that human was going to be had already been decided. Is the future closed? Is it open? Is it both? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, folks, and thanks, Dr. Gulliver. I think what I'd just like to say just before we open to questions, remember Dr. Gulliver was saying that he was particularly keen to get some of our perspectives on this in relation to disability studies and so on. And I just think what I would like to just mention is that we had, you know, the conference in the 2019 Disability and Disciplines Conference. I'm hoping that some of you might be thinking back to the brilliant keynote we had from Professor Tanya Tichkowski, which chimed very much, I think, with what Dr. Gulliver had to say today. And obviously, he hasn't heard that yet or seen that yet because it's not live on YouTube yet. But I think you'll enjoy that, Mike, when that comes around, and it makes a nice connection across a few of the things we've done here. I just wanted to mention that, like I say, I was just hoping that some of you were perhaps thinking along similar lines. Could I ask anyone to identify themselves if they've got a question? What I'll do is I'll just make sure that you've said who you are, then I'll step out of Mike's way and Holly will be over to you with the microphone. So if you can just wait till she gets to you. Anybody? Any questions or comments for Mike? Okay, so excellent. We've got Dr. Owen Barden here in Liverpool.
Thank you, Mike. I enjoyed that very much. Funny enough, I'm Dave Hanson here, but I was very much thinking about the conference, and actually more than just Tanya, because we had 2 or 3 speakers talking about the environment climate change, but particularly from the perspective of blindness. And they were talking, this idea of blind sensorium came on, the idea that you, it came up a few times, the idea that, you know, if you are blind, then your sensory experience of the world is a certain way, and that can help us all in enrich our understanding of the natural world, one of the things we're talking about. And so I know you don't speak for the deaf people that are paying to point that out, but I wonder from your perspective, how do you see that idea related to deafness? What can deafness bring to our understanding of climate change and the other issues identified in terms of the environment?
So it's interesting. I did, on the way to my PhD, I did a master's in human geography, and so my PhD is theoretically in historical geography. I use a lot of spatial theory in looking at the history of the deaf community. And that question of the sensorium comes up a lot. Obviously, you know, if you take a human as a being inside a fleshy package, they produce themselves into reality through that package with whatever's available to them, and appropriate the environment in whatever way that fleshy package allows them to get hold of it. And there's interesting, I've just been working with a deaf colleague of mine. Actually sent me a paper that he's writing, which he hopes to publish into a geography journal, which looks specifically at deaf space and its origins within the deaf body. There's been very little done at that embodied scale. There's been a lot done on bigger scales, urban scales, national scales, transnational scales, buildings. David mentioned the Deaf Gain work. Hansel Dirksen Baumann, who was an author of that book, one of the editors of that book, his brother Hansel is an architect of deaf space in the States, and he's worked on those kinds of things. There's been very little done on the body, and that engagement with the environment from within a predominantly visual and tactile body, rather than a body that has both sight and sound, and then a body that has only sound and tactility rather than sight, produces a radically different reality, you know, with hugely different possibilities, those kinds of things. Deaf people haven't, to my knowledge, although there's a movement certainly within the deaf community that parallels the kind of movement that we see within aware hearing communities towards vegetarianism, vegan, those kinds of things. Possibly because deaf people travel a huge amount and seek each other out, and so that international awareness that deaf people often have tends to be greater than hearing people. They haven't engaged with the consequences of environmental change, particularly. But what we are seeing are the consequences of things like environmental change in migration. So there are an increasing number, I believe, of deaf people coming and moving, migrating and moving around. And then we have researchers at Heriot Watt in Scotland who are looking at areas of interlanguaging. You know, I mentioned the fact that sign languages are all different, but they can interlanguage in very sophisticated ways. Deaf people coming in from places, and this is not just environmental, but economically, they're coming in and then interlanguaging to communicate with deaf people in the UK. And some of those things are being studied by people like Annalise Custers, Jemina Napier, and others up at Scotland. The extent to which deaf people will actually engage in the environment, I think, will tend to be in the same way that hearing people would. It's a world in which we live. It's interesting, a lot of this is kind of at a theoretical level at the moment. The implications of this haven't really dropped out of that critical level into lived reality yet. I don't know, I'd be interested. What were the kinds of implications that were coming out of that, of things like environmental change for others who live in different bodies? Or have I missed the point and waffled sideways on something else?
Speak for us as you might speak for people. So one of the ideas was I guess around that different sense of aesthetics and the way that we appreciate the natural world and the natural environment, and how that might relate to our wish to care for it better. And I suppose those kinds of ideas might be one of the things.
So yeah. Certainly deaf people have different ways of presenting that. One of the things that's quite often levelled at deaf people when they say, oh, deafness isn't a disability. It's not, it's just another way of being. You can't hear the birds. So I can't hear the birds, you know. But I can see water. I can see water cascading over rocks. And I was treated to the most extraordinary performance of a river by a deaf man that I knew who sadly died, who profoundly deaf from very early childhood, I believe, who performed the water as it jumped and cascaded over the rocks, and then likened it to the sound. He said, as a hearing person, this maybe sounds like violins in an orchestra to you, but he performed it with the glinting and the movement and the, you know, so it's that engagement visually with a visual environment, an environment in which percussion has a meaning. Thunderclaps, things like that come across as percussive. They're not sounds necessarily, and the flashes, but where dappling and light and movement. If you want to see some of that, have a look at, there's an art movement called Devere art, which you may have heard of. But it's specific art done by deaf artists from a deaf point of view, and it captures nature and weaves in, particularly things like hands become leaves, trees become trees with hands, because that's the sign for tree. So you have the leaves, and they become the leaves, and the sun that moves up, and of course the sun is light, and without light you don't have visual language. So although there's a tactile version of sign language, you don't have light. So the relationship between deaf people and light and brightness and clarity in the environment and things like that. So no, it's an interesting question. It'd be interesting to explore more. Maybe my colleague will do some of that.
I don't know about that 5 minutes anyway.
Yeah, can I just ask, can you hold that a sec, Irene? I just want to see if we can get one in Carlton and keep swapping. I'm not quite sure how quick I am to do this, but can we get a question from Carlton?
Yes.
My colleague? Oh yeah, okay.
I'm Sandy Barron. I'm a PhD student here, and I study deaf politics and deaf history in Western Canada in the 19th century, for the most part. So I'd just like to say, yeah, thanks very much for this talk. This was really fascinating, and one thing that sort of stuck out for me was you focused a lot on sort of an individual paradigm. Perhaps I'm misreading what you were saying, and one thing that you could consider, and I'm sure you have, being someone who's studied deaf space, is that there's also social and political innovations that deaf communities sort of can undertake that are very different than the kinds of engineering and biomedical sort of innovations that you're talking about. So one that I'm thinking about it specifically is in North America, and I can't speak for Britain, I'm sure this is sort of happening as well. There's a movement amongst a lot of deaf communities, especially in the United States and to a lesser extent in Canada, to even not necessarily move away from an idea of deaf culture, but to expand the definition of that to include oral deaf, to include people who use cochlear implants, and to sort of, as a political response to the kinds of future repression that you're talking about, the innovation there is to sort of expand the definition of the community and to grow it and to increase political voice through political unity. So I'm not really sure what I'm saying here, but I found your perspective really fascinating and really rich. But I felt like the politics, in the same way that you're talking about basically human destruction of the environment doesn't fight back. But I feel like maybe take more into consideration that deaf communities and deaf people can. Does that make sense?
Mm. Yeah, it does. Sandy is your name, isn't it?
Yes.
So, yeah, thank you, Sandy. Yeah, there's probably a few things to say on that. You're probably aware of work by people like Paddy Ladd and others in the deafhood kind of strain, and Paddy's quite clear there in his work that deafhood is a process of becoming that is effectively open to all deaf people, no matter how deaf and no matter at what age they become deaf. It's a becoming towards a form of visual humanity. I guess this chimes with Ben Bahan's work on the visual variety of the human species, those kinds of things. So that question of becoming and deafness and inclusion, we used to make a big point over here of separating between big D deaf and little d deaf, if you read any of the British literature on that. That's now deaf academics, led by deaf academics. They're moving away from using that now to use lowercase d. The reason is because it's exclusive and it denies those who are audiologically deaf the ability to be part of the politics and the culture and movement. And of course, they're not denied it. They simply move into it in a different way. That's also become something that's become more possible as the boundaries of deaf and hearing have been blurred by things like cochlear implants, where you have people who can hear very well who are deaf. Questions around coders, children of deaf adults, are they deaf, are they hearing, they're audiologically hearing, they're culturally potentially deaf. So that is shifting and moving here as it is over there. And you're right, I mean, the environment doesn't fight back, although it kind of does. Deaf people do fight back. Deaf people also go away. I mean, we've got these situations where we've had proposals of deaf commonwealths. If the hearing world won't accommodate and imposes things, deaf people will simply leave and go and set up somewhere else. What's interesting is something we looked at in deaf studies and never really managed to get to the bottom of a few years ago, but seems to be the case, is that North American deaf politics and European deaf politics seem to be quite different in the way that they've interacted with the wider disability movement. Deaf people, and again, I must underline that I'm not speaking for deaf people, but the literature and the evidence seems to suggest that because of places like Gallaudet and because of a strong deaf linguistic culture in North America in which sign language and written English were both championed, North American deaf people have worked alongside other in inverted commas, disability activists and have maintained a voice in that debate. And so deaf people have very actively used the agency that disability legislation gives them in places like the States and in Canada to campaign for their rights. In Europe and in the UK, the relationship between deaf people and the wider disability movement has often been quite fraught, because in the UK, many deaf people were deprived of spoken language because they couldn't acquire it, and therefore written language, and so they really struggled to become an active part of the disability movement when it emerged in the 70s. The disability movement was quite keen to adopt deaf people as spokesmen or icons, because sign language is cool and very visible and very different and very effective, but deaf people really struggled to get a voice and to influence, except some of those like Marianne Corker, who were hard of hearing predominantly. So in the UK, it was very much a question of what was your native language and whether you could read and write really well. And so the history, the disability versus deaf activism engagement in the two continents has been quite different. So some of the things that are potentially open to deaf people in North America would seem not to be open in the same way to deaf people here. But it is an interesting area to explore.
Okay, thank you.
We've got a question from Irene Rose at Hope in Liverpool.
I'm happy to forego it, David, if there's another
No,
from...
we're waiting for it.
Oh, right, okay. Where's the mic? Oh, sorry. Hello, thank you very much for that talk in the past meeting. You did mention at the beginning that we could push you for your thoughts, because it appears to me, I may pick this up wrong, but the eco-modernist movement may sacrifice a lot of the deaf culture at the moment, or deaf people, whereas degrowth reverts back to valuing. That's how I read it, what you said. So if you wouldn't mind, I would ask you to talk a little bit more about that in terms of you're talking about and the future of Imagine, and what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I guess. So eco-modernism is the idea that you can uncouple technology from the environment, and that there will be, in time, technological solutions to address issues that come up with the environment. So, for example, if we have a problem with CO2 in the atmosphere now, then we can bank CO2 and suck it out of the atmosphere, and we'll have technologies to be able to do that. The technology, the agency that technology gives you is utterly fascinating. The freedom that people will actually have to use that technology is open to question. I'll take cochlear implants as an example. Cochlear implants currently communicate on a number of channels. The quality of the sound that they produce is not the same as natural hearing. People will learn how to use them, their brains learn what the sound looks like. We're not at a point yet where you could take a standard out-of-the-box natural fully hearing person and put a cochlear implant in and they would hear just the same. But it's not beyond the evolution of the technology to do that. When they do that, if it's safe, and that person then judges that the inconveniences of potentially having to change the batteries every 20 or 30 years are worth it, they could decide to have a cochlear implant to then artificially mediate their hearing and to switch it off. As somebody who struggles with sensory stuff, particularly around sound and overload of sound, I would welcome that. Now the thing is, if that eco-modern future, if that all worked out and I had that ability, that's great. But there's a lot of ifs on the way. Would I be allowed to do it? Would it be considered good medical practice to destroy a cochlear that's already working? You know, I could biohack it, but And then would deaf people be allowed to do it? And then, so in theory, on the horizon, there's that possibility of being able to engineer this agency into bodies and for us to be able to change the thresholds of our bodies to do all kinds of things. There's a lot of ifs, a lot of regulations, a lot of policy, a lot of agency, probably a lot of doing things behind the scenes and, you know, to get that done. But there's a huge potential out there. At the same time, degrowth takes us in the opposite direction. It potentially takes us into a world where we reject medical interventions. I mean, we've seen the anti-vax movement in the States. You know, again, there are all kinds of potentials for unbalancedness in the pursuit of the natural. But what that natural gives us is a situation where humanity is as diverse as it's ever been, and where we commit, instead of to solutions, we commit to a solution of taking time to work with all the differences. And it's fascinating. If you go to a conference and you see multiple sign languages being used and multiple deaf-blind sign languages being used all at the same time, that you can have, you know, 6, 7, 8 interlays of different language and speeds and things, and it takes a long time to communicate, and communication is the goal. And that is a human thing that we communicate. So it brings a richness. So, and this maybe goes back to Sandy's question. You asked what my personal thing is. I would love to have the agency to be able to change my body to do things. I'd love to be able to have the agency over the environment to stop it from bombarding me with so much stuff. I would love us to be in a situation where we could be open to diversity and actually prioritize communication and interaction rather than trying to fix things, which I do think has a bottom line financial imperative attached to it. Many of those things are probably in conflict. I think ultimately we're probably a mixture of both. You know, like I said in response to Sandy's question, we have in the past seen situations where deaf people have elected to, for a variety of reasons, but have proposed the establishment of separate communes and states, commonwealths and villages away from the hearing world in response to, if you're not going to stop interfering with me, we're just going to remove ourselves. At the same time, we have more and more deaf people now voluntarily having cochlear implants, but remaining deaf and remaining signers. They're using the agency that engineered bionics is giving them for different areas of life. So I think we're going to see both. Yeah.
We're just coming up towards, excuse me, we're just coming up towards 3:30, but I think it would be good if we could get another question from our colleagues at Carlton before we finish, if possible. If you have a question, that is, in Carlton, at Carlton.
I have one, David. Hi, it's Ryan Patterson. I'm a lecturer here at Carleton.
Excellent. Hi, Ryan. Okay, well, I'll just pass you over, but I will have to make this relatively brief. I say this to Ryan and Mike.
Hi, Dr. Gilbert. Thank you again. At all levels, fascinating talk. Really launching off what you just said and linking it back to the you brought up at the beginning the mothers and the group of mothers having expectations of effectively curing, inverted commas, their kids. Is there much concern in the either medical community or maybe in the deaf community over now questions of consent, where if you've got a child who has a meningitis vaccine, of course that child never becomes deaf through meningitis. But I imagine there are now with cochlear implants a 10-year-old child who's very literate, or not literate, fluent and living a deaf world, but being 10, effectively their parents can put them in to have surgery to have their hearing fixed. One would hope parents would discuss that with the child, but I can see some seeing it as an illness, not so much doing that. Are we seeing that coming up more, where there's a disagreement over that with youth?
Yes. Is that brief enough, David?
Maybe.
Yes.
No, okay, touch more. Yes, because there's a time imperative. If you have a child who's so we now screen children within days of birth for hearing. If they are diagnosed with any kind of hearing difference from normal, there's an automatic assumption that there'll be some kind of intervention. The idea that a parent might wait, there have been, I'm not sure there have actually been attempts, there might have been attempts. One of the parents on the panel spoke about how she had been threatened with social services for neglect of her child, for failing to implant them. So the idea there is they're found unfit to be parents. And so there is this huge pressure. On the other end of the scale, that particular child didn't have an implant until they were much older, and then for a variety of reasons elected to have an implant. And of course, as a child gets older, they begin to know their own mind, and you begin to be able to engage with them. And this particular child is in a school for deaf children, but her speech and her hearing, now she does have an implant, is very similar to that of a hearing child. It used to be seen as a kind of cultural, if I can sign it, as a kind of cultural over here within the deaf community to have a cochlear implant. A parent would be looked at, it would almost be considered tragic if they decided to, in inverted commas, try and fix their child by giving them an implant. That's not so much the case anymore. That is shifting as adult deaf people are beginning to take these on. The deaf community, I think, is very open to some of these differences and these debates, and the parents are open to it. What we're finding is that the people who aren't open to it are the audiologists, some of them, and those who automatically assume that, of course, there is a solution to this, and why would you not take it at every opportunity? And in some ways, that kind of goes back to the previous question about agency. You know, to what extent do you have agency to reject a medical intervention if you want a particular type of life? Does that answer your question, Brian?
Yeah. Yes. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Okay, folks, then I'll just say a few quick thank yous. Amy Scott has helped as ever today as an administrator. My support worker, Holly, has been incredibly helpful, as has Brian, the IT guy who we rope in whenever we're making a link with Carlton. All our colleagues at Carlton, we really appreciate that time is different over there, and it might not be quite so straightforward, so thanks for bearing with us. It's always so nice to have that extra link and so on, and a group of people who are of like minds over there in Canada. Obviously, everyone who's arrived and attended today, because as I always say, we can't carry on doing these events unless people turn up for them, even though we do get them onto YouTube, which is down to my colleague, Dr. Owen Barden, and that's much appreciated. We'll get this one up as soon as we can. We do have to go through a process. Mike has kindly agreed to fix the captions, and then once we've got it to him, he'll do that, and then Owen will get it up on the YouTube channel so people can carry on engaging with us. And those Disability MA students and all the students who are here today can then quote that directly from the YouTube channel, if you see what I mean. But obviously, most of all, I'd just like to thank Dr. Mike Gulliver for a fascinating talk, and he says he came from a perspective not informed by disability studies along those lines, but I certainly had no conflict with what he was saying. It was very respectful in relation to disability studies, and I would suggest informed us in disability studies greatly. So thank you.